your answer.
Okay. Hi, I'm Murillo, and what my research project is trans identities in Hollywood and how representation of trans identities have changed over time and what it means. So before I can really go into anything, I feel like we have to contextualize a few words that I'm going to be using a lot. Number one is trans identities. This includes anything that falls under the trans umbrella, so transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, it includes all that. Hollywood movies, it doesn't literally mean Hollywood movies as in taking place in Hollywood, but it does mean that popular are movies that are popular in the United States and have a presence in society as some sort of for the media that it is. And then the general public, that's just the specific majority of people or the unspecific majority of people. So we're not looking at specific groups here. We're just looking at people as a whole. There's no demographics that are being considered here. We're just talking about people like at face value. Okay, so specifically, what is the question looking for? So it's actually looking at representation of trans identities and minorities. Lots of studies that I found had to be about minorities as a whole, and so having to change this focus on trans identities was really important. And so I had to consider both minorities and trans identities. This is about historical changes. So we're looking back about like 30 years in the past to see how things have changed. Not too far, but enough to where it's kind of where it started popping up in relevancy, and we're looking at the general public's perceptions of representation. So we're not looking at trans identity perceptions of representation, and we're not looking at my representation of perception of representation, but we're looking at just the general public's opinions, which we're going to collect on a different site. Alright, so how did we get here? Immediately I knew that because I want to have a career future in the film industry, I decided that it'd be a really good idea to look into the film industry for my research project. I definitely want to make it LGBTQ focused because it's something that's very unrepresented, especially in like my age range, and it's just not something that's very document recorded, so I think it's really important to look into those things. And I want it to be something that's influential and implicit. So movies, they have a lot of messages to them that people don't necessarily catch on. Things aren't really always obvious, so I think it's really like important that we make sure that we acknowledge that things can influence us and change how we perceive things and the implications surrounding that. So why representation of trans identities? Well, like LGBTQ identities, trans identities are probably one of the most unrepresented groups. For some people, seeing them in media might be the only time they hear or interact with trans identities, so it's really important that media gets this correct. And representation is both important to the minorities that it's representing as well as the majority that are unfamiliar with it, which is something I found in my studies, but I figured it would be really important to preface now since it's a consistent basis that we're going to be assuming from here on out. So what am I doing? So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking at popular Hollywood movies and sort the reviews as positive and negative. I'm going to analyze the data from these reviewing sites, and we're going to decide what that can mean. So how am I going to do this? I think I'm not sure if this is the right term for it, but we're going to be doing like a mixed qualitative and quantitative meta-analysis. So even though the reviews are qualitative, and we're going to use the data to quantify the information that we're going to get, and we're going to be generalizing representation of trans identities as a whole. So we're looking at the change over time. So what is the goal? So our goal is to find a trend in how our goal is to find a trend in how we're looking at representation. I think that it's also important that we might have to reconsider how we represent because of its importance and the implications behind it. And we want to understand the changes in representation over time and how things have changed in just Hollywood and movies in general. So what did I learn in my literature review? So one important thing that is going to come up is the types of representation that are present. While there's a few types that were mentioned in a few studies, the most important ones are intentional representation, which is when movie makers or anyone in the field decides to intentionally represent a character or a given group with a character or metaphor or anything along those lines. And the other most important is proxy representation. So it's representation that's not necessarily intentional, but it's associated with a minority to the point where because it's automatically or familiarized with it, it's unintentional representation that becomes representation for a given group. We also learned that negative representation is just harmful in general. A big example of this is just vilification and exploitation of minorities done historically. for multiple reasons, mostly because minorities need to be coded into characters in order to be seen on screen during a certain point in time, and that this outdated formula is kind of what serves for the formula that we represent today. You know, like a long history of negative representation still peeks its head when we're looking at representation today. Another thing we learned is that representation is best when it is both made by the minority and when it is removed by an irrelevant context. So it's important that minority groups get the opportunities to represent themselves on the screen, and it's important that they get to represent themselves based off their own identities. So what's our method? So our method is actually going to be about movies, or it's going to be about movies that are representing trans identities that are selected. We're using these movies that are popular and that have some cultural impact. We're sorting these reviews as positive and negative, as well as other categories that we'll get into later when focusing on the method. And we're comparing these numbers to the other films present. So we're going to be comparing all the films mentioned to each other. So the site we're going to be using actually is Rotten Tomatoes, which is a very popular movie reviewing site that's user-centric and focused on the users, and most of the content is actually by the users. Anyone with or without credentials can post a review, but most importantly, I found that word-of-mouth sites are essential to a movie's growth, therefore making it important that these sites have some sort of influence over the movie industry. In the method that we're going to be using, there's going to be some terms that are more nuanced, so we're going to define them here before we explain them. Positive would be anything that's beneficial or accurate for representation. A negative representation would be anything that's exploitative or villainizing. Inconclusive would just be unclear but opinionated, and unrelated or inaccessible reviews are pretty self-explanatory. They're unrelated or inaccessible. So the way I organize my data is as shown here. It's for each movie we're going to have this little box here that's going to be showing the positive representation, perception representation, negative, inconclusive, and unrelated. And we're going to make those into percentages, but when we go to the percentages, the unrelated information is negligible, so we just don't consider it. So which movies did I choose? I only chose movies that have Academy Awards and nominations. That doesn't necessarily validate the movies, but it just means that they have some sort of influence or some sort of popularity over the general public. Anything that has a popular director or actor, lots of movies end up becoming hits because they have niche characters or niche actors or directors that people like to flock to. And anything that has to be at feature length, so no short films, even if they're really popular and really important. None of those are considered here in this study. So our first movie is actually Silence of the Lambs. So why? It's because it's an Academy Award. I think it's for Best Actor, and this is actually because it's transcoded and not intentionally or not inherently representation for trans identities. So this is an example of proxy representation, and regardless if it's intentional or not, it's generalized as something that includes a trans character. Second of all is Boys Don't Cry. This one's also Academy awarded. I think it was for Best Actress. This is actually a trans story, but the place that makes it interesting is that it's actually played by a cis actress. Third movie I chose was Tangerine. This has a famous director, Sean Baker, who you might know from The Florida Project or other A24 films, and it's another trans story. It's also played by a trans character and a trans actress. And then, fourth of all, we have Assassination Nation. Another famous director, Sam Levinson, also contains a trans character and a trans actress, but a non-transcentric story. So, with the data that we got from these reviews, I found that overall, that we can see here, first of all, that does this have a pointed?
It doesn't, unfortunately.
Alright. We can see over here that from movies ranging in chronological order from left to right, that positive representation to negative representation is inherently increasing. We can see that the newer movies actually have a greater percentage of positive perceptions, and that the older movies actually have a greater percentage of negative perceptions. So this is essentially showing us that the general public perception of positive representation has increased over time. We can see that trans stories are actually capable of having bad representation, as we can see that Boys Don't Cry, a transgender movie, is actually considered negative representation, and we can see that newer movies are shown to be have more positive representation. So what limitations did this show, or what limitations were present in this study? Biggest one is that demographics of users were ignored. This is intentional because you can't really get this information out of Rotten Tomatoes in general, but I do think that it's something that could be important to how we can digest the data. It was a really small range of films that we found, even though I did say that they had to have some sort of popular basis. There was very little movies that I found that could really classify under these. So I feel like if I just expanded my qualifications and criteria, I could definitely get more films to represent more accurate numbers. And honestly, there's just not enough data to make major claims. I can't really claim that this is that an increase of representation is beneficial to trans identities as a whole with any data to back it up, other than the previous information that I gathered that it's important to minorities. So I can't really claim that negative representation is harmful outside of a filming context. So what implications does this present? I think the biggest thing is that one thing is that people actually do actively think about representation, even though there were a lot of unrelated responses. There were a good number of them who actively acknowledged the representation that was present in the movies, and so I think it's really important that these people, or that we consider that the general public does consider representation. I think this also shows that movie makers are partially responsible for the representation that they show, because it does have a lot of like effects, and it's very much like visible in these movies, and that perception of representation is actually it actually affects the perception of the minorities. So when you're representing someone in a film, you're also representing someone who, you're also not just representing their identity in that given moment or that character's identity, you're representing that moment or that group as a whole. And with that, I conclude here that representation matters. As I explained earlier in my with my literature, that representation is very important in movies, and that representation of trans identities in general is making a positive change, which is very much beneficial without having any data to back it up. And also that this outdated, harmful formula used to make negative representation is slowly being undone, and we're slowly making a better representation as a whole. So with that, thank you.
Okay, so I'll ask our 3 questions here real quick. How did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
Oh, that definitely changed a lot. Like, a big thing is that having to choose to include inconclusive data, or having to choose to make it a qualitative process rather than quantitative, not looking for specific words. That changed a lot. If I did a quantitative method, like inherently qualitative, I would have to, a lot of the information that I got wouldn't be able to be used because they don't use specific words or specific criteria that I would have otherwise used if I were to do that. And I think that honestly doing it qualitative and quantitatively gave me a much more available data set to work with.
How did your new understanding address a gap in the scholarly conversation?
A big thing is just that not only are LGBTQ identities in general just unrepresented in the academic world as of until the past decades. Trans identities in general are just a very unrepresented topic, and so I think that just having more conversation about them, especially in movies, which is even more specific, just adds to the academic papers that hopefully can expand and be and represent the identities that I represent.
How did you handle the uncertainty of the research process?
A big thing that was very uncertain was that I would get, conclusive data, that people would explicitly go out of their way to mention representation, which I did mention in my findings was surprising, but very much considerable. I think that if there was a lot of if there wasn't enough responses that were about representation, I honestly would have changed my method, my approach. And instead of doing qualitative data, I would have definitely just looked into whether they thought it was a good movie or what would be best based off of what information I did have at hand.